Thanks very much, Malcolm. It's all complicated. Our next speaker is also a health professional, Levett. She's been a registered nurse for more than 30 years, and she's now the nurse manager for professional development and clinical liaison in the South Eastern Sydney Local Health District. She's also the federal president of the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation and the president of the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association, a position she's held for over 10 years. So here's somebody who knows all about the practical side of things. Welcome, Levett.
Thanks very much, Richard, and it is nice to see so many people here today, and thank you for inviting me. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we have this forum today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Now, just to let you know, if anybody does need rescuing, I'm your person. I'm an expert at CPR. In fact, I was assessed just last Thursday, so I'm fresh even. What I would ask, though, is if you do feel the need to collapse on the floor clutching your chest, maybe you could do it at a height, because I've had a knee replacement last year and I don't kneel so well anymore. But listen, we'll get around those issues, and I'm sure I could instruct Malcolm and refresh his memory on how to do CPR should the need arise. Are there any nurses in the room today? Welcome, and I acknowledge my colleagues and thank you for coming. Euthanasia, as you know, is a subject of ethical debate. I speak here today as an individual and not as a representative of my employer or the organisations for which I hold elected honorary positions. I will say that the Australian Nursing Federation has a membership of 240,000 members, and which makes us the biggest trade union in Australia. We are a trade union, and there would be some people in this house that would refer to me as a trade union thug. Alex, I'm sure, is not one of these, and I'm very pleased about that. But I don't see myself that way. I see myself as a representative of the nursing profession, and a very proud one at that. Having said that, the Nurses Associations for which I am president, that is the federal body and the New South Wales state one, both support my right as a member to speak openly on the subject of voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. That's a good thing. I have published an opinion piece in a prominent Australian nurses journal twice now on this subject, with mixed response, I'd have to say. Most non-supportive comments did not come from within the profession that reads the magazine generally, but from other members of the community that obviously got hold of a copy somehow. Interestingly, one of the biggest criticisms I endured when publishing on this matter was that I was criticised for having the audacity to try and influence others in my profession. I've got to say, I worked hard to get to this position where I am now, and pretty much the reason I did it was to have influence on both my profession and others, which I'll allude to shortly. So it was an interesting comment anyway. Now, voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide are currently unlawful in the Australian context. Bear with me if I don't quite get the terms right throughout my speech this afternoon. What I mean when I talk about those terms is the self-elected process to end one's life, and not anything else. But this is not a subject that I've spoken on before, and it's not a subject that I'm an expert on. But I do know nursing, and that's what I'm going to share with you this afternoon. I'm here to talk about some of the ethical and practical considerations that impact nurses and nursing as a profession, both on the domestic front and also internationally. As some of you will know, a Tasmanian nurse, Catherine Ann Pryor, in 2005, was found guilty of assisting her terminally ill father's suicide. To do that, she risked a 14-year custodial sentence with her actions, simply to end her father's suffering. The decision to give her a 2.5-year suspended jail sentence was the right one, and that's what happened. But all through that case, if any of you do remember it, there was a constant referral to Catherine's occupation, her being a nurse. Now, although she didn't carry out that act in the conduct of her profession, she did it as a daughter, a loving daughter to her father. But it was something that the media and the community picked up on and continued to use that terminology, clearly indicating maybe a different level of expectation from Catherine, given she was a nurse. That's open to interpretation. So where do we stand with this sort of issue with nursing? There are a number of codes of ethics that we have access to and are indeed bound to abide by. Probably the two main ones. There's an international code of ethics for nurses produced by the International Council of Nurses. There is the Code of Ethics for Nurses in Australia, produced by the National Nurses and Midwives Board. And there's also a Code of Professional Conduct for Nurses in Australia that might be considered to touch on some of these issues or ethical issues as well. But in any of these documents, there is no specific mention of voluntary euthanasia or assisted suicide, and as such, they're completely open to interpretation on the issue. You could say that they're less than helpful on this issue. So where else do we go to see what we should do? In January 1995, the then Royal College of Nursing Australia took the unprecedented step of releasing for comment a discussion paper entitled Euthanasia, an Issue for Nurses. Responses reflected a diversity of knowledge, opinion, values and beliefs about euthanasia and assisted suicide. They showed a need for information and guidance on how to best respond to the complex and controversial issue. It also highlighted the absence of the professional nursing organisations having a definitive stance on the euthanasia question and the need to adopt a formal position either way on the role of nurses in assisting with euthanasia practices. So there was nothing there. Since then, the Royal College of Nursing Australia, which doesn't exist anymore by the way, it's now the Australian College of Nursing, but at that time it released a paper called The Politics of Euthanasia, a Nursing Response, to help nurses formulate their own thinking and viewpoints on the subject and to be able to contribute to a broader professional discussion on the whole issue of the right to die. This resulted in the Royal College of Nursing Australia issuing its first position statement on voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide, and that has subsequently been revised a number of times, reaffirmed, and is, I think the most current draft is 2006. Meanwhile, following the passage of the Northern Territory's controversial Rights of the Terminally Ill Bill in 1995, which came into effect in 1996, the Northern Territory nurses had to confront the reality of being enabled by law to participate in euthanasia and assisted suicide before the broader nursing profession had reached a position on the matter and had determined what it regarded as acceptable standards of nursing practice in relation to the actual practice of euthanasia and suicide, assisted suicide. So this was quite a dilemma for the nurses at the time, probably one that just hadn't been thought of beforehand. The Nurses Board of the Northern Territory responded immediately by formulating and ratifying a formal position statement on euthanasia, albeit a little bit late. Now, only as recently as 2006, the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association produced its first position statement on voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide, and in 2007, the Australian Nursing Federation, as it was then, issued its position statement on voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. Both of those position statements have subsequently been reaffirmed and are quite current. The respective situational positions taken by the former Nurses Board of the Northern Territory, the Royal College of Nursing Australia, and the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association and the federal body have been appropriate. But even so, the vexed question remains of what, if any, formal position should professional nursing organisations adopt on the euthanasia-assisted suicide issue. At the moment, we have, with those position statements, I'll just tell you very briefly, the Australian Nursing Midwifery Federation one, so that's the national nursing body. It's very disappointing, the position statement. These are all publicly available on the websites if you care to look at them. It's disappointing because it's neutral, in my view. It does, however, talk about the role for nurses to participate in the debate, and it is supportive of legislation reform that gives the right to choice. That's about as strong as it gets, so that's the federal position statement on this issue. In New South Wales here, also disappointing. Our position statement is also neutral. It does have a right to express a personal view in public debate. Hello, I'm here. And action, and it also supports the right to self-determination. So they're sort of tinkering around the edges there without actually saying, yep, we think this is what should happen. And that's what they've both done. The Australian College of Nursing, their position statement is even worse. It's not just, I'd call it very disappointing, it's neutral and says nothing. It doesn't give nurses the permission, if you like, or the encouragement to speak about it or to do anything. It's pretty much a non-event. Now, there is one good thing I will tell you about position statements, and that is the Australian Nursing Midwifery Federation South Australian branch. So the federation is made up basically of the state branches of this organisation. The South Australian branch just this year have released their health policy position in the lead up to the South Australian election for 2014. It is the most progressive position statement on this issue by nurses to date. It is, and I quote, supports access to voluntary euthanasia and other end-of-life choices. So just in those very words, they actually come out and say, we support this. This is a really good thing. Now this document that they've published, again, freely available on their website publicly, and it's a whole policy document. This is just one aspect of it. And it's under the section of advocacy for patients. But they're very clever, and they've produced this document to lobby government, obviously, in the lead up to the state election next year. There's also another group in South Australia called the South Australian Nurses Supporting Choices in Dying group. And it's a lobby group actively trying to get the legislation changed in South Australia. In particular, the Ending Life with Dignity Bill 2013 that's currently before the Parliament. So they're quite an active state, and I'd have to say the most progressive in the country. And that's really good for them to be leading the way there. Now, the position of international organisations I'll just talk about briefly is a little different. Euthanasia, as you know, is a subject of ethical debate. And in countries where euthanasia has been legislated for, such as Holland and Belgium, the literature on the subject mainly considers the role and responsibilities of doctors in the process. Now this is interesting because euthanasia very much concerns nurses, and empirical research in these countries, as well as countries with no such legislation, refers to the involvement of nurses throughout when it comes to euthanasia. Owing to their specific position in the care of dying patients, nurses that is, and their expertise in palliative care, nurses are ultimately involved in the entire process of caring for patients who have requested euthanasia. Their role in caring for these patients, as well as their feelings about involvement in euthanasia, is very complex. Personal conflict, moral uncertainty, political naivety, frustration, fear, secrecy and guilt all exist. For these reasons, to date, there has been no universally agreed nursing position on euthanasia or assisted suicide. Reflecting the moral complexity of the issue, different nursing organisations in different countries hold quite distinct and sometimes opposing views on the matter. For example, the United Kingdom Royal College of Nursing and the American Nurses Association have respectively published statements rejecting the role of the nurse in participating in or assisting with euthanasia. In contrast, other nursing organisations such as the National Nurses Association in the Netherlands have stated positions that support the role of nurses in assisting patients to die, and not surprisingly, the International Council of Nurses has no stated position on the issue at all. It's very disappointing, I'd have to say. Now, the ethical arguments about euthanasia in the literature are one that I'll just very quickly go over with you. The 4 principles of medical ethics, well known, are respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, do no harm, beneficence, do good, and justice. Comprise in large measures the nursing ethics debate on the same subject. The nursing ethics literature reveals that these principles are put forward, often manipulated and interpreted to support arguments both for and against. So they're not serving any great purpose, because for every argument that says these are the things and these are the reasons we should support this issue, the same arguments can be turned around to say we shouldn't. So why is support for euthanasia not overt? First, taking a definitive stance either way carries the risk of alienating and incurring the mistrust of constituents, for example, members of an organisation, patient groups, allied health workers, who hold counter values and beliefs to those espoused. Secondly, taking a definitive stance risks nursing organisations being wrongly aligned with extremist right to life or right to die lobby groups, otherwise associated with their own respective stances. Again, risking the members of that organisation not being happy with that view. Finally, taking a definitive stance risks eroding and undermining the foundational purpose of nursing organisations themselves, which have principally been formed to develop and advance the profession of nursing and its capacity to provide excellent care. Now, I can tell you from my own experience in the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association, we are very much driven by our members and what they think, and the very minute we do something that not all of our members agree with, we are punished. We are punished with the withdrawal of their membership. And like a lot of organisations, we're heavily dependent on that. In fact, our survival depends on our growing membership. And so if we do things that jeopardise membership too soon, we risk not being there at all to even have the argument in the first place. So it's a fine balance. We want to do something, but we've got to be a little bit careful, which is one of the reasons we're not overtly party political, you might notice. Now, although the studied neutrality stance, which we seem to take, taken by Australian professional nursing organisations stands, is an important benchmark for other nursing organisations. It is important both within and outside of Australia, because we are looked upon as leaders. The position statements in question are respectful of the fact that members' normative orientations encompass a mix of conservative, progressive and religious secular values. Moreover, they do not treat these values and orientations as necessarily being in opposition to each other. They can see that we can have our views within the organisation, but we don't necessarily need to take one or the other. Now, just very briefly, there's a few interesting facts I found in the literature about this issue. Holland, a study done in Holland in 2008, or reported in 2008, about the attitudes of voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. It was quite a large study, and remembering euthanasia is legal in that country, it clearly showed a difference about when you survey nurses about this issue, about whether you survey nurses in countries where euthanasia is legal or it is not. So you get very mixed results. The same survey will result in very mixed results depending on which country you do it in and what the law is in that country. What we do know from the Dutch experience is that nurses were not adequately consulted in the lead up to the legislation change in that country. The nurse's role, according to the legislation, is one of consultation only, yet 12% have delivered the fatal drug with no legal provision to protect them. So although this country has good euthanasia, voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide laws, they decline to mention the nurse's role anywhere in that legislation, knowing that a large portion of nurses do in fact give the fatal drug. We also know that in that country only 45% of nurses are willing to sit on the voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide review committees. They are an essential part of their legislation. Nurses in that country are now trying to remove some practices from their responsibility in this area, that is, preparing the drugs for voluntary euthanasia and cannulating the patients for that specific purpose. So we've got some issues to learn about that country's experience, and I'll allude to those shortly. In Belgium, 2004, study of the involvement of nurses in physician-assisted dying. Very large study, nearly 4,000 deaths were reviewed. And keeping in mind the study was conducted in 1998, prior to the implementation of the Belgian Euthanasia Act of 2002. Now in that time, nurses administered lethal drugs in up to 58% of euthanasia cases in Flemish healthcare institutions and over 17% in people's homes. Now this is the role of the nurse in that situation, even before it was made law. Most of those lethal drug administrations were made in the absence of the prescribing physician. This practice places nurses in a very precarious legal position because they are not officially authorised to administer lethal drugs to patients even now. Belgium also, there was another study done in Belgium about the role of nurses in institutional ethics policy formulation, which showed that their legislation literally talks about the need for the doctor to have discussed the issue with the nursing team and the right to refuse to participate. That's about the sum total of the nurses mentioned in the legislation in Belgium. In the US, a study of critical care nurses across the US, which asked the question, they asked their membership, while a critical care nurse, have you ever administered a medication to a patient or performed some other act with the intent of causing or hastening that patient's death, other than with the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment? Now 17% had received requests from patients and family to perform voluntary euthanasia or assist with suicide. 16% said they had engaged in such practices. This is the US, don't forget, nationally. And 4% reported pretending to give life-sustaining treatment, life-sustaining treatment that in fact had been ordered. Another way of skinning the cat, I guess. Now, when that study was published, that big study in the US, that author, Dr. Ash, was heavily ridiculed by many about, the flawed nature of the survey and how outrageous it was, and it ought not have been published, and the question was vague. A lot of comments about the vagueness of the question. Now, I read the question. As a health professional, it was pretty clear to me what they were asking, but it just shows you, when you go out on a limb as a health professional and talk about these issues or do research in this area, you put yourself out there for very heavy criticism, and it comes from all angles, and that's exactly what happened there. Now just back home to Australia. In 1989, Coos et al. Studied nurses' attitudes to voluntary euthanasia in Victoria. So this was a study of Victorian nurses. 78% were in favour of legalising voluntary euthanasia, and they found it ethically acceptable to do so. 65% of nurses in that survey were willing to be involved in the euthanasia process if it were legal. And they also in that study established a strong relationship with religion and came up with the stronger the faith the nurse had, the more likely they were to oppose euthanasia. Probably not a lot of surprises there. They also found that younger nurses were more likely to be in favour, i.e. those under 40. That's an interesting one. Also in Australia in 1996, Kitchener studied nurses' attitude to voluntary euthanasia in the ACT. They studied 2,000 ACT nurses. Now at the time that was half of their workforce. 69% were in favour of a change in the law to support voluntary euthanasia, and 33% of palliative care nurses only were in favour. So a big difference between the general nursing population were in support, but palliative care nurses, it was a much lower figure. In 1997, my own organisation, the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association, studied our membership. So this is just New South Wales, and it was just around 500 of our members responded to that survey, which showed that 80% of those surveyed were in favour of a change to the law to support voluntary euthanasia, and 70% were in favour of a change to the law to support assisted suicide. Interestingly, a difference there. And it's interesting that the difference was lower to support assisted suicide, when really that is the mechanism by which a person is able to end their own life through a bit of assistance, rather than have somebody else do it for you. I think some of that also might be the level of understanding about the two issues, and the fact that it's got the word suicide in it, people sometimes are uncomfortable with. That same study did show also that 70% of the nurses were willing to be involved in voluntary euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide if it were legal, and 22% said they were willing to administer the injection if the need was there. I just want to briefly talk about the politics of nursing, because this is where the problem lies for us. Why are nurses so apparently undecided about this issue? The issue of voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide is a political one. Nurses are uncomfortable with politics. I've got to tell you, over many years I have provided training in leadership and indeed politics for my colleagues, and I quiz them each time I get a group together about what politics means to them. And that's all I say. What does it bring up in your mind when I ask you what politics is? The summary of thousands of answers are power, deals being made, Canberra, unethical compromise, public officials, legislation, negotiation, elections, lies, men in suits, campaigns and arguments. Now, with a response like that, is it any surprise that we're uncomfortable with politics, if that's what we think it is? So, obviously I spent a lot of my time trying to turn that view around and I guess enable a different view of politics and why it is so important to nursing. As a profession inherently responsive to people, we cannot separate ourselves from politics and public policy. But many nurses want to do that. It's just what they want to do. They say, I just want to go to work for the day and be a nurse. But every aspect of their role has a political implication or connotation, whether they know it or not. Nurses are Australia's largest group of health professionals by a long shot, and are the primary advocate for the people in their care. They have never played their proportionate role in helping to shape health policy, even though health policy profoundly affects us both as health providers and consumers. We still like to leave it up to someone else to manage the process. Only by being willing to enter into the political arena can we ensure that our governments legislate in the interests of the health needs of the community and of individuals in it. Nurses must find their voice and use it. So where to now? I've got some very practical solutions about what we need to do about this, these ethical issues and this problem and this lack of documentation. The nursing professions must take a more active role, it's clear, in the voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide debate. We must listen to our community and our patients. We must reflect the dominant views of the community and our profession. We need to create opportunities to be heard. We need to engage in and participate in robust research on the issue. We need to educate ourselves and learn about the issue in the first place. We need to engage with organisations such as Dying with Dignity to keep informed. We need to become more comfortable with politics and engage in the process. We have to have the important conversations with our colleagues, our patients and their families, but we need to know what to say. It's not just about saying anything. We've got to have the right conversation. We've got to know what to say. We need to have the important conversations with our government representatives, and we need to know what to say. We need to ensure the role and responsibilities of nurses are adequately included in voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide legislation. We've got to learn from the Belgian and the Dutch experience to deny nurses inclusion in this process, or indeed the right provisions in the legislation could make the process flawed and indeed have undesirable outcomes at the other end. Nurses are very much involved in the process, and therefore the legislation needs to reflect the role and responsibilities of all health professionals that are involved and not just the doctors. We need to have the courage of our convictions, and we need to be prepared to stand by them. We need to stop sitting on the fence and follow the Australian Nursing Midwifery Federation South Australian branch's lead on this issue in terms of an identified position statement, and the active lobbying of government. It is inevitable that legislation permitting voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide will eventually pass in one or more Australian state and territory. I'm confident of that. I feel that we are close to this time now. My profession will play an important role in such legislation, so we must not overlook their critical role. To do so may have a negative impact on the success of the legislation. So, I will continue to voice my opinion about this issue, knowing it is the right thing to do, and I will unashamedly continue to use my influence in the political and professional arenas, even if some of my colleagues don't agree with what I have to say. I thank you for taking the time to come and listen to me today.